Welcome to In the Word, a study of the International Bible School lesson. Join us as we learn from area professors and teachers as they bring you their thoughts and knowledge of the study of the Sunday School lesson for today. Now, here is today's program.
Good day to you. What a pleasure it is to have you join us as we continue our conversation in the Word. We're especially grateful to have the opportunity to study 5 lessons from the Sermon on the Mount. This is our third of this series of 5, and we're now right in the heart of Matthew chapter 5, where Jesus is talking about the law and our tendency to sometimes misapply the law, and his offer of some very helpful correctives as we understand what it means to live the Christian life fulfilling the law through Jesus. Dr. Roberts and I are at it again and grateful to be able to have this conversation. The Sermon on the Mount is certainly rich in practical instruction, isn't it?
Definitely, yes.
We started out with the Beatitudes, which are, oddly enough, about attitudes,
right.
Even though that's not the meaning. That's not the meaning of the word beatitude.
Right.
And Jesus importantly begins with character traits and attitudes, who we are as that which undergirds our ethical behavior. And then he moved on to
salt and light,
emphasizing the fact that our lives are meant to, our lives of Christian character are meant then to have a positive impact on those around us. But we've already moved now into the action mode.
Right.
Where
and
behavioral...
he stressed that he's not abolishing the Old Testament. He's building on it.
Yeah.
And now he gets specific about how some things from the Old Testament can be quoted and then misused.
Yeah. So he gives us 5 or 6 practical examples of that. Laws which were very well known even in Jesus' day, and they're well known in our day as well, and how they can be interpreted in a way that sounds affirming, but it actually kind of undermines or takes the heart out of the ethical teaching. So we're going to see 3 examples of that today, and in the next lesson a couple more.
In the last lesson, he talked about your righteousness exceeding that of the Pharisees and teachers of the law. We'll see today how he emphasizes that exceeding.
Yeah, that's right. And it's so interesting because the Jewish religious leaders of Jesus' day appeared to, at least on the surface, to emphasize the law and support the law. The Pharisees are the most obvious, and they're often connected to the teachers of the law. They numbered the laws. They made it their goal to obey all 617 of the laws. And they appear to have supported it, but as we mentioned in the last lesson, they undermined the law in ways that kind of devalued it in Jesus' view because of their lack of sincerity. The Sadducees are also interesting. They were the priests, and they emphasized the ceremonial law.
Right.
And so they, in their worship at the temple, they kept all the requirements of the law there, but they pretty much ignored the moral, ethical. So all groups of religious leaders seem to have pretended, at least, or given the impression that they valued the law and then undermined it.
Yeah.
Jesus wants to show the principles undergirding the law, I think. And so in each of the examples we look at today, we're going to see that he affirms the law, but then emphasizes the undergirding principle.
He takes it to a deeper level. And it's more than just the surface.
Yeah. Each of these examples follows a pattern that I think it might be helpful to know. He begins with the saying, "You have heard it was said."
Yes.
In every one of them.
Yeah.
Why does he use that exact wording, do you think?
Well, it sounds like, and one commentator emphasized that the problem in that day was that there were teachers who were taking the law, and Jesus is not disputing what the law said, and he affirms it, but they were teaching that law statement in a way that modified it, lessened it, gave exceptions to it. And so he says, you have heard it was said, not what it was written. We find a contrast when he quotes the Old Testament. He said, it is written. But here he's saying, you've heard it was said.
So in a sense, Jesus in this section of the Sermon on the Mount is not really in conversation with Moses, the lawgiver. He's in conversation with the teachers of the law of his own day,
Right.
who are, in his view, misinterpreting or misapplying the law. Right?
That term scribe in the King James is used as teachers of the law here, but it's the lawyers who studied the law and knew the details of it and would give interpretations, quite often changing the original meaning of the law to an interpretation that was more comfortable.
Yeah. And we know this was done to Sabbath laws and to food laws and to many different things where there would be some an interpretation that ended up undermining the principle of the law. So we'll see how that manifests itself in the examples that we're coming to today. So he begins each of these teachings with the saying, you have heard that it was said in the oral teachings of the scribes.
Yeah.
Then he goes on to word the law itself. You shall not murder, you shall not commit adultery. So he quotes the law. Then he says, but I tell you,
Right.
and here's where he introduces his corrective. And then he gives the principle that he wants to teach, Jesus' own teaching. And then he follows that up, the fifth part, with an elaboration or an explanation or examples or application of his understanding of the law.
Yeah, and this was such a contrast to the teaching of the day because famous rabbis, those who were considered significant, were famous because they could quote all the rabbis who'd gone before them to support whatever position they were taking. And so you would have a rabbi who would just string off one quote after another. Jesus doesn't do that. He just says, you've heard it was said, here's what was written, but I tell you.
This is what it means.
This is what it says. Yeah.
And when we see the writings of the rabbis as they're collected in what's called the Mishnah, it's kind of interesting because you say, Rabbi so-and-so says this, but Rabbi so-and-so says this, and they're rather different interpretations.
Yeah.
And that's what the people of Jesus' day were kind of stuck with, competing interpretations coming from these great rabbis. Jesus said, let me tell you how it really is.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, and we'll come to the end of the Sermon on the Mount, and the people were amazed at the authority with which he taught.
Yeah. Well, why don't you read these first three examples for us?
From Matthew 5, verses 21 to 32. You have heard that it was said to the people long ago, you shall not murder, and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment. But I tell you that anyone who is angry with a brother or sister will be subject to judgment. Again, anyone who says to a brother or sister, Rakah, is answerable to the court. And anyone who says, you fool, will be in danger of the fire of hell. Therefore, if you're offering your gift at the altar and there remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift there in front of the altar. First go and be reconciled to them, then come and offer your gift. Settle matters quickly with your adversary who is taking you to court. Do it while you're still together on the way, or your adversary may hand you over to the judge may hand you over to the officer, and you may be thrown into prison. Truly I tell you, you will not get out until you have paid the last penny. You have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to stumble, gouge it out and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to stumble, cut it off and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to go into hell. It has been said, anyone who divorces his wife must give her a certificate of divorce. But I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife except for sexual immorality makes her the victim of adultery, and anyone who marries a divorced woman commits adultery.
All right, three challenging teachings from the law here, and that Jesus tries to put on a proper footing. We begin with a quote directly from the Ten Commandments, right? You shall not murder,
Don't murder.
which is right there. The first part of the Ten Commandments emphasizes our relationship with God. The second part emphasizes our relationship with one another, and this heads the list. So it forbids physical violence, to kill another person. Jesus corrects any effort to limit the law to physical violence by saying, no, there are many forms of violence, and all of these forms of violence are inappropriate for a kingdom person. And so he very quickly adds that anger or angry words, name-calling, fits in the same category, which is kind of interesting, isn't it?
Yes.
And I think it's a good reminder to us that there are many forms of violence, some of which we take very seriously, like murder, and others which we kind of pass off, and boys will be boys. Oh well, it's only words. Words don't really hurt, or something like that.
Or just has a tendency to fly off the handle, or whatever.
So we kind of excuse other things. Jesus doesn't seem to be willing to excuse any form of violence, whether it's oral, verbal violence, or emotional violence, attitudinal violence, or as well as physical violence. Maybe before we explore the meaning in too much depth, we need to clarify some language here. We have this word raka in our translation in verse 22, and then fool in verse 22 as well. The word raka is an Aramaic word, which was the language that Jesus spoke, and we still have a few of his Aramaic words in the Greek text of the New Testament. And then the word fool is a Greek word from which we get moron. Moron. Now, you've got a good understanding of that word fool.
One
should
commentator was saying that it's really reflecting on the character of the person. It's like calling somebody a scoundrel.
Okay. So it's more than just saying you're foolish or you're silly. It really casts a serious
because Jesus used the word fool sometimes in talking about somebody who makes a foolish conclusion or whatever.
Right.
But here it's an accusation of epithet.
It's character assassination.
Right.
It casts an aspersion on them. I've been taught and have read about the word raka, that it's actually more, it means stupid. That's its main meaning, like idiot or stupid, lack of intelligence. But that it also suggested, much in the way you're saying, that it suggested a moral failing, not just a lack of intelligence, but someone who lacked moral sensibilities. So these are words that go well beyond, I'm not defending stupid as an appropriate term, okay? My wife says that stupid was one of the words that got their mouth washed out with soap when she was a kid, not just cursing, but even stupid. So I'm not defending the use of the word stupid. I'm saying that these words go well beyond a comment on a person's intelligence.
All right.
And so there's a form of character assassination here, verbal violence,
Yes.
that is really an attack on another person.
Yeah.
Well, I wanted to clarify those words just a little bit. By the way, the word court in verse 22 is interesting. It's actually the word Sanhedrin, which is the Supreme Court of the Jews.
Yeah.
But it's unlikely that every one of these little cases that he's talking about here would have been brought to Jerusalem before the Supreme Court of the Jews.
Yeah.
So the word also appears to apply to local councils of village elders who would be called on to apply the law to moral situations that are going on there. So there's a little bit about the wording there. Now, anger or wrath and verbal violence are two forms of violence that Jesus suggests we should take pretty seriously here.
Yeah.
And I think we can apply that to our lives. The way in which we relate to other people in marriages or in family, the way we talk to our spouses, the way we talk to our children.
Yeah. There's a lot talked about road rage nowadays.
Oh,
That's this anger you have with another person where you destroy the worth of the person, sometimes literally, physically.
Yeah. I may have mentioned before that the only time I really criticized my mother about her upbringing of me was to tell her that I was disappointed that she had lied to me when I was in first grade by telling me sticks and stones will break your bones, but words will never hurt you. And I learned pretty early when I went to elementary school that no, words could devastate you.
Yeah.
I never got in fights when I was a kid, but I have had my spirit killed on several occasions. And I can tell you to this day events in my, when I was 5, 6 years old, when someone spoke a harsh, mean, insulting word to me, and I've never forgotten it.
Yeah, and a lot of adults are suffering from psychological abuse because of words that were spoken when they were children.
Which demeaned them, questioned their worth as human beings.
So when Jesus is saying this, he's not overstating. It's a reality that we recognize in our society today.
And by pushing his the meaning of this law beyond the physical murder, he's touching on a principle of anti-violence that he says pervaded the law. That was the principle, and we need to take the principle seriously, not just the one manifestation of it. He applies it or elaborates on it in verse 23 in a way that I think we should understand as hyperbole. Because he gives a scenario here in which somebody that he's teaching up in Galilee would be going to make an offering to God at the altar. Well, there was only one altar.
In Jerusalem.
And that was way down in Jerusalem.
Right.
So he's imagining a situation here in which someone would plan and execute a very long and difficult journey walking down to Jerusalem and then go to the temple with an offering and then suddenly remember down there that somebody had something against you, that you had offended them way back up in northern Galilee, and that you lay your pigeon or your lamb or your grain or whatever down, and then spend a week traveling back up and reconcile and then come. Well, that's kind of a impossible situation. Yeah. So what he's done here is imagine a completely unlikely, almost impossible scenario in order to drive home a point, which is what hyperbole is. Yeah. And the point is, be reconciled.
Be reconciled.
Be reconciled.
And reconciliation is an emphasis that Paul makes in his letters, that we are called to a ministry of reconciliation. And that was Jesus' emphasis here. Just saying don't murder, yes, of course, don't kill somebody, but you can hurt people, and you need to be reconciled.
Right. So he's counseling not just avoiding violent sin, but actually overcoming violence that has already been done through a proactive act of reconciliation. And he elaborates that further in verse 25, where he says, don't wait for a court verdict to decide which of you was at fault. Make up
Settle
on the
things
way
out.
there.
Yeah.
And it's interesting, both of these examples here suggest not that the person he's talking to was the victim, but that they were the perpetrator of the violence. If someone has something against you, if you've done something wrong, not if they've done something wrong to you, but if you've done something wrong to them, and you are the one who's liable to be thrown into jail.
You've got an adversary taking you to court, and there's a whole lot of time and expense in court even today.
Right.
And he's saying, settle that. You
Settle
don't need
that.
to go through all that.
Besides, who's right and who's wrong isn't really the point. It's reconciliation, Jesus says. That's the point. One commentary I read suggested that this idea of paying the last penny suggests that this may be a situation of indebtedness, and that the conflict is a debt. And that's very likely. I think that's helpful to think of it that way. And where they're going to be thrown is debtor's prison, which was very common in those days, the offense of indebtedness. Well, the first example then is about violence. And Jesus says, look, it's not just enough to avoid physical violence. We need to avoid violence of all kinds, verbal, emotional, attitudinal. And the way best to avoid it is to seek reconciliation with people with whom we are at odds. Well, let's take a look at the second example, which is about sexual sin. We had violence, now we have sexual sin.
You've heard it said, don't commit adultery. Well, that's the law, don't commit adultery.
That's one of the 10 Commandments.
But it was apparently revised or interpreted in such a way that the strength of it was weakened. And Jesus is saying it's not just the physical act of adultery. It's also the mental, spiritual.
So it's parallel to you shall not murder, isn't it? Yeah. There are other forms of sexual immorality that Jesus suggests can be just as destructive to relationships and to individuals. And so he expands it to think about emotional, visual, attitudinal,
looking lustfully, attitudes,
thought patterns. He said there's just like there's a form of physical violence that doesn't there's a form of violence that doesn't involve physicality. There are forms of adultery that don't involve the physical act of adultery. It can be what we look at or what we train our minds to think about. And this is also applicable to our lives today, isn't it?
Oh, it is. We were aware that pornography is a serious issue in a lot of situations, a lot of people. And our society has just kind of gotten acclimated to it.
Yeah, I was just thinking recently that whereas in days of our youth, pornography was there. I mean, it's been there throughout human society, but it was kind of a secretive and shameful thing. And now it's almost become normalized because it's so public and so available. And so this teaching is all the more important for us. To drive home just how dangerous and destructive sexual problems are, Jesus resorts again to hyperbole. And talks about gouging out the offending eye or cutting off the offending hand if it becomes physical. And I think we all agree that this is hyperbolic, right? This is not
There have been people through Christian history who've taken it literally and abused their body. And clear back to the Council of Nicaea in the 300s, the church came to the general conclusion that is not what Jesus meant, and that is not the proper interpretation of what he's saying here. He's saying that it would be better, but that's not what you should do. You need to clean up your attitude and your spirit.
And by using these two hyperbolic examples of the eye and the hand, he's reinforcing his teaching here, which is that, yes, there is the physical act of sexual impropriety, but then there's also the visual, the attitudinal, the mental, whatever. So, he's not advocating physically destroying your body, but he is emphasizing the seriousness of it. Now he follows this up with a very brief teaching about divorce, which was there in Jesus' day and is in our day as well. And he quotes a teaching by Moses, which is recorded in the books of law, but it wasn't actually one of the laws, was it?
It wasn't a part of the Ten Commandments.
Yeah.
And again, it has been said, anyone who divorces his wife must give her a certificate of divorce. Later on in chapter 19 of Matthew, the question is directed to Jesus, what about divorce? And he deals with it and says that the intention of God was for marriage to be lasting.
Right.
Divorce was a concession that Moses made because it was happening. But it's not God's intention.
Right. And the quote here, to be clear, is not a twisting of the law by the Pharisees of Jesus' day. This is a quote from Moses. But it's a quote of a concession made to say that if divorce must occur, then it must be done for legitimate reasons. And this was especially problematic in Jesus' day because some rabbis were giving men, husbands, permission to divorce their wives for the most frivolous reasons at all.
And a woman couldn't divorce her husband at all.
Right.
Only the husband could divorce.
But rabbis were known to say that you could divorce your wife for burning your supper. Or for just some frivolous...
Or if he just happened to like someone else better and she didn't measure up.
Your preference. If she had lost the bloom of youth or something like that.
Right.
I mean, that's literally what they said, that you could do that. And so once again, Jesus is reiterating the principle. He's not into making excuses. I was just thinking about it, I didn't really do it. No, he doesn't buy that excuse. And he doesn't buy this excuse of whatever reason either. He emphasizes the fact that divorce was not part of God's plan, and we can see that because the consequences of divorce are so devastating.
They're painful to anyone. And it's generational. It doesn't just the couple. It's the children. It's the families of both.
Now, the last thing we're doing here is trying to imply that divorce is the unpardonable sin. It is not. But we're just trying to take seriously the emphasis that Jesus puts on the devastating results of a life that yields to violence or to sexual immorality or to a relationship that is marred by divorce. And Jesus says we need to take all this very seriously and understand why God created us for relationships the way he did.
We'll have lessons later on in this quarter about marriage. We'll talk more about
I'll come
this
back
later.
to it there. Well, we've run out of time, so thank you all for joining us. Feel free to go back and study these teachings from chapter 5 in Matthew more on your own. We'll look at 2 more examples from this section. Hope you can join us for our next lesson. We'll see you then.
This has been In the Word, a study of the International Bible School lesson brought to you as a ministry of First Christian Church in Johnson City, Tennessee. Our thanks to our teachers that led us for this week's lesson. Join us again next week for another lesson from the International Bible School lesson text. This has been a production of First Christian Church.